Still in my memory, yes, 1960. Still in my memory, it was right here in Trinidad. Things happen both good and bad. One thing would always stay with me till eternity. Was a day of all days to remember. When we marched in the rain without premier. One voice, one prayer, one cry, one call. Freedom, independence for one and all.
Uncle Sam, we walk back we land, we walk back we land. Uncle Sam, Uncle Sam, we walk back we land, we walk back we land. Uncle Sam, Uncle Sam, we walk back we land, we walk back we land. Uncle Sam, Uncle Sam, we walk back we land, we walk back we land.
On what should have been our historic Independence Day, cheated of our rights and frustrated in our aspirations by the flimsiest legal quibble and constitutional technicality, the British and American governments forced every step to retreat from their untenable positions on Chagaramas, have agreed to discuss revision of the 1941 agreement on one condition, that they will not discuss with Trinidad and Tobago. The British and American governments have, it is common knowledge, intrigued in West Indian politics at 11 o'clock in the morning. You have responded magnificently. The trade unions, the economic associations, the citizenry generally, and the members of the People's National Movement, men, women, and children from all over Trinidad and Tobago. We march in our thousands. We march for freedom. We march not only in Port of Spain. Our march in Port of Spain is the symbol of our march throughout the West Indies. We march legally and constitutionally in a grand political demonstration without liquor, without jumping up, without calypsos, without disturbances, without molestation from onlookers and spectators, without injury to private property of any sort, peacefully and without missiles on the route prescribed by our party. With the eyes of the country and the West Indies and the world upon us, we march with discipline, dignity, and decorum as befit the citizens of the country who have publicly declared our intentions of independence. Yes. We march to show and tell the world that if we are not yet independent in law, we today and after today are independent in fact. Yes. Our enemies said we would never be free. They said we would never be fit for freedom. They said we could never govern ourselves. They said that we were a lazy, servile race, desirous of only sitting in the sun and eating yams and pumpkins, capable only of aping the graces of our European masters. They said we could never operate democratic institutions. We could never be governed along European lines. Our magnificent demonstration today gives a lie to this imperialist indictment of the West Indian people. We have the spirit of independence, the capacity for independence, the readiness for independence. Only the form is lacking. Our demonstration today serves public notice that we are not prepared to wait any longer for the gift of grace of what is ours as of right. From today, April 22nd, 1960, 11 a.m., we are a different people. We are not what we were on April 21st. We are here today as West Indians, a new nation born out of the amalgam of disparate cultures and different racial stocks. Our demonstration today demonstrates national unity. Let us go forward in national unity, the country of all and for all, with a career open to talent, without the racial discrimination of the past and the social sycophancy nurtured thereby. Let us march united, resolved to recognize the equality of all West Indians, moral, religious, political, and legal. Resolved to expunge from the West Indian vocabulary the nomenclature of colonialism, niggers and coolies, chinks and limeys. Our demonstration, such as this, is not only a political leap forward, it is also a spiritual purification. As we search forward confidently to meet the future, we bury the past. And so symbolically, as we ready ourselves for a demonstration of a people determined to be free, let us consign to the bonfire the 7 deadly sins of which we have been afflicted. The 1956 Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago, we consign it to flames, to hell. The Constitution of the West Indies, we consign it to flames, to hell with it. The Moody Report on the site of the federal capital, we consign it to flames, to hell with it. The Telephone Ordinance of 1939, we consign it to flames, to hell with it. The DLP's racial statement on Guyana, we consign it to flames, to hell with it. The Trinidad Guardian, we consign it to flames, to hell with it. The UK-US agreement, Chagaras Agreement of 1941, we consign it to flames, to hell with it. Long live self-governing Trinidad and Tobago. Long live the independent West Indies.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is NICOLE CROOKS, and I am the Senior Manager, Human Resources, Industrial and External Relations at the bank. On behalf of the Governor, Board of Directors, management and staff of the Central Bank, it is my pleasure and privilege to welcome you to the 31st Dr. Eric Williams Memorial Lecture. We are truly honored and appreciate the presence of Dr. the Honorable Keith Rowley, Prime Minister of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, and Mrs. Sharon Rowley. The Honorable Mr. Justice Ivor Archie, Chief Justice of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, and Mrs. Denise Rodriguez Archie. Senator the Honorable Mrs. Bridget Anisette George, Speaker of the House of Representatives, and Mr. Newman George. Members of the Cabinet of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, Ministers of State, Your Excellencies, members of the Diplomatic Corps, Governor of the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, Mr. Dr. Alvin Hilaire and Mrs. Sheila Hilaire. Yes, you can clap. Members of the Judiciary, Parliamentary Secretaries, Senator the Honorable Mr. Nigel de Freitas, Vice President of the Senate, Mr. Esmond Ford, Deputy Speaker of the House of Representatives, members of the Senate and of the House of Representatives, Dr. Denise Soyafat Angus, Presiding Officer of the Tobago House of Assembly and Secretaries of the Tobago House of Assembly, accredited Chief Representatives of international organizations, Ms. Maureen Manchuk, Chairman of the Public Service Commission, and Ms. Lynette Stevenson, Ombudsman, Mrs. Jennifer Daniel, Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs, and Head of Foreign Service, and other permanent secretaries, Mr. Beresford Riley, Chief Personnel Officer, Commodore Hayden Pritchard, Chief of Defense Staff, mayors of city corporations, mayors of boroughs, and chairmen of regional corporations, senior government officials and heads of department, chairmen of statutory boards and authorities, Dr. Cary Fraser, our distinguished lecturer, and Mrs. Pearl Fraser, former governors of the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, Dr. Uric Bob, Mr. T. Ainsworth Harewood, and Mr. Ewart S. Williams, former deputy governors of the Central Bank, Mr. Jerry Hospitalis and Ms. Amoy Changfong, family and friends of Dr. Eric Williams, students, teachers, and parents from Queen's Royal College, St. Francois Girls College, Astra Girls College, Arima Central Secondary School, and the University of Trinidad and Tobago, staff and retirees of the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, other distinguished ladies and gentlemen, members of the media. I trust that you enjoyed the exhilarating production that opened our event this evening. Our intention was to take you back to that auspicious day of April 22nd, 1960, and evoke some of the emotions of the people who were listening to Dr. Williams speak on the issue of Chagaramas and our forging forward as a nation toward independence. I cannot resist sharing with you that the crowd voices that you heard were done by the bank's external relations staff. Clearly, we have actors and actresses among us. I would like to make special mention of our delegates from Mozambique who spent this week with us on an information gathering mission. We were very happy to have you here, and we're happy to have you here this evening. Please allow me to mention the students and the teachers of the schools that I referred to earlier. You see, for us, your presence is really important because we believe in the famous words of Dr. Williams that the future of our nation is in your school bags. It is through intellectually stimulating experiences such as this lecture that our young people will broaden their appreciation of the nation's history and will be inspired by those who have gone before. Parents and teachers, thank you for your foresight and your dedication to excellence. I also wish to extend a special welcome to the members of the public who have joined us via live stream on the bank's website. As many of you may know, this lecture series is the bank's annual flagship event. While our public outreach role is quite distinct from our core mandate as a central bank, we take it very seriously. Every year, we aim to improve the caliber of this event and to showcase the talent of our staff, our country, and the region. We are delighted that you have all taken the time to be our guests this evening as we pay tribute to the life and work of Dr. Eric Williams, our first Prime Minister. This evening's lecture will focus on Dr. Williams' success in challenging the British and the United States of America to hand over Chagaramas to the people of Trinidad and Tobago. We reached out to Dr. Fraser to be our featured speaker this evening, as he has published significant work in this area, and we are quite certain that he will deliver an educational, spirited, and thought-provoking lecture for us tonight. I kindly ask that you put your mobile phones on silent. Please note that videotaping of the event is not allowed. I now invite the Governor of the Central Bank, Dr. Alvin Hilaire, to deliver opening remarks and to introduce our distinguished speaker for tonight's lecture, Dr. Cary Fraser.
Thank you, Nicole. Welcome, everyone, to the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago. We are really happy that you took the time to be with us tonight. On behalf of the Board of Directors, management, and staff of the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to our 31st Dr. Eric Williams Memorial Lecture. We appreciate and are honored by the presence of Dr. the Honorable Keith Rowley, Prime Minister of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, and Mrs. Sharon Rowley, the Honorable Mr. Justice Ivor Archie, Chief Justice of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, and Mrs. Denise Rodriguez Archie, Senator the Honorable Mrs. Bridget Anizette George, Speaker of the House of Representatives, and Mr. Newman George, members of the Cabinet of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, Ministers of State, Your Excellencies, members of the Diplomatic Corps, members of the Judiciary, Parliamentary Secretaries, Senator the Honorable Mr. Nigel De Freitas, Vice President of the Senate, Mr. Esmond Ford, Deputy Speaker of the House of Representatives, members of the Senate and of the House of Representatives, Dr. Denise Sawyerfat Angus, Presiding Officer of the Tobago House of Assembly and Secretaries of the Tobago House of Assembly, accredited Chief Representatives of international organizations, Ms. Maureen Manchuk, Chairman of the Public Service Commission, and Ms. Lynette Stevenson, Ombudsman, Mrs. Jennifer Daniel, Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs, and Head of Foreign Service and other permanent secretaries, Mr. Beresford Riley, Chief Personnel Officer, Commodore Hayden Pritchard, Chief of Defense Staff. Let me take a breath. Mayors of city corporations, mayors of boroughs, and chairmen of regional corporations, senior government officials and heads of department, chairmen of statutory boards and authorities, Dr. Cary Fraser, our distinguished lecturer, and Mrs. Pearl Fraser, former governors of the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, Dr. Uric Bob, Mr. T. Ainsworth Harewood, and Mr. Ewart Williams, former deputy governors of the Central Bank, Mr. Jerry Hospitalis, Ms. Amoy Chanfong, and Dr. Terence Farrell, family and friends of Dr. Eric Williams, students, teachers, and parents from Queen's Royal College, St. Francois Girls College, Astor Girls College, Arima Central Secondary School, and the University of Trinidad and Tobago, staff and retirees of the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, other distinguished ladies and gentlemen, members of the media, good evening. Okay, a very warm welcome to every one of you, and thank you again for taking the time to be with us tonight at one of the bank's major public outreach events, and one that we consider, as Nicole said, a worthwhile avenue of education and inspiration for our entire society. For many of you, clearly this is not your first time being here at the Eric Williams Memorial Lecture. Over the years, we have had the pleasure to listen to speakers deliver compelling lectures based on the legacy of the founding father of the nation, including the very memorable Eric Williams and the Emergence of the National Energy Sector by Professor Kenneth Julian, and the Promise of Caribbean Unity by the Most Honorable P.J. Patterson, former Prime Minister of Jamaica. And last year, Sir Hilaire Beckles gave a passionate and riveting presentation on the university sector and economic development in the Caribbean. In this edition of the distinguished lecture series tonight, we focus on Dr. Williams' challenge to the colonial government, Britain, and to the United States of America to relinquish control of Chagaramas as a military base and return it to the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. This was a significant moment in our journey towards independence. And the presentation we saw earlier recreated some of the fire and excitement of the dramatic time in our nation's history. It was produced by the Lloyd Best Institute of the West Indies with the assistance of members of the External Relations Department. Dr. Williams, I'm sure you would agree, was admirably portrayed by Calypsonian Kurt Allen. We do hope that we have succeeded in setting the stage for our featured speaker. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the formal withdrawal of the United States from Chaguaramas, and it is therefore fitting that we have as our featured speaker this evening a scholar who has paid particular attention to our national struggles at that time. He is also no stranger to Trinidad and Tobago, having lived, studied, and worked here for some time. Dr. Cary Fraser is a political scientist and historian who has pursued a career both as an academic and public intellectual, working in the Caribbean and in North America. He has researched, written, and lectured on various topics dealing with US foreign policy, international relations in the 20th century, imperialism and decolonization, the politics of race in the Americas, and international relations, particularly in the Middle East. Dr. Fraser's influential book, Ambivalent Anti-Colonialism, The United States and the Genesis of West Indian Independence, reshaped the discussion about the relationship between the Caribbean and the United States. Dr. Fraser has enjoyed a diverse career ranging from secondary school teacher in his homeland of Guyana, associate professor at Pennsylvania State University, program officer with the Social Science Research Council in New York, and project officer for various Caribbean social interest organizations. He has also served as president of the University of Belize and is currently associate professor in the Department of Government and Justice Services at Appalachian State University in North Carolina. This evening, it is with very great honor and pleasure that I invite Dr. Fraser to deliver the 31st Dr. Eric Williams Memorial Lecture on the theme, Chaguaramas and the Caribbean Identity, exploring the diplomatic legacy of Eric Williams. Join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Fraser to the stage.
Good evening. Protocol having been observed, I would still like to recognize the Honorable Keith Rowley, Prime Minister of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, and Mrs. Sharon Rowley, the Honorable Mr. Justice Ivor Archie, Chief Justice of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, and Mrs. Denise Rodriguez Archie, Senator the Honorable Mrs. Bridget Anisette George, Speaker of the House of Representatives, and Mr. Newman George, Governor of the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, Dr. Alvin Hilaire, and Mrs. Sheila Hilaire, Deputy Governor Sandra Sukram of the Board of Directors, other distinguished ladies and gentlemen, and my friends whom I have known over the 40 years since I first came to Trinidad. I chose this topic tonight because in a very interesting way, we are at a moment in historical time that is very similar to the period that led to Dr. Williams embarking on a political career in Trinidad and Tobago. This is the most significant shift in the international system since the rise of the non-aligned movement, and thereafter, the beginning of the end of the Cold War. We are now at a point in time in the history of the world where the Asia-Pacific region is becoming, in fact, the central axis of the international system, displacing the North Atlantic. And I think Dr. Williams's extraordinary perspicacity during the 1950s was a major factor in reshaping the future of the region. And I'd like to explore some of those issues tonight. When I received the invitation to deliver the lecture, I was immediately drawn to the idea that I would be able to explore an issue that has intrigued me in recent years. How could Eric Williams's diplomatic strategy, deployed during his years of leadership of Trinidad and Tobago, be useful in the contemporary context of the Caribbean? When I came to St. Augustine to pursue graduate work at the Institute of International Relations in 1977, some 40 years ago, I had chosen to pursue graduate work at UE because I wanted to spend some time living in another Caribbean society. And Trinidad and Tobago interested me since it was both similar to and different from Guyana. For someone who as a child watched the capital city of Guyana, Georgetown, burn, in the memorable verse of Martin Carter, were some who ran one way, were some who ran another way, were some who did not run at all, were some who will not run again. Black Friday 1962 was a traumatic moment that defined my life thereafter. My interest in the study of politics was forged from that experience as a child, and my decision to enroll at St. Augustine was driven by what I recognized later as the subconscious desire to compare Trinidad and Guyana and the differences in their political and cultural trajectory. As a high school student, I was aware of the 1970 events in Trinidad, and it was apparent that the hushed tones in which the events in Trinidad were discussed reflected painful memories in Guyana, even as Guyana had decided to move towards the status of a republic in 1970. After completing undergraduate studies at the University of Guyana, I thought that Trinidad could open a way to explore the past and try to make a sense of the tragedy that befell Guyana. When I came to Trinidad, I was fascinated by both the capacity for self-renewal and the self-deprecation that informed the popular culture of Trinidad. I had been intrigued by Eric Williams as both a politician and a historian as a result of reading Capitalism and Slavery, while I was an undergraduate student at the University of Guyana. Williams's book then led me to C.L.R. James's seminal exploration of the Haitian Revolution, The Black Jacobins. And from both Williams and James, I learned to think about the Caribbean as a place that was transformed by the arrival of Europeans, but which in turn contributed to the transformation of Europe. It was at the Institute of International Relations that I met Lloyd Best, who served as my thesis advisor for the study of who had weathered many a storm and demonstrated a personal and political resilience that often confounded both his allies and his critics throughout his career. In his essay, Eric Williams, The Legacy Continues, the late Rex Nettleford cited Norman Manley's observations about Williams. He should not be thought of as only a split personality. He's the most complicated little man I've ever met. It was perhaps both an expression of personal frustration on Manley's part and a compliment to Williams's intellectual prowess and the inscrutability that characterized his political style and his approach to governance. I would also suggest that Williams was both complicated and complex, and it was that combination that made it very difficult for his peers and others to understand Williams and to anticipate his responses or his initiatives in public life. His decision to study history confounded his father, and that decision was an early sign of Williams's capacity to confound others in both life and death. I was first alerted to this quality in Williams while reading in the late 1980s the diplomatic records of the US State Department dealing with the Chaguaramas dispute. Those records reveal Williams to be a political leader who understood the power of surprise in negotiations, in national politics, and in playing the long game in international diplomacy. For Williams, surprise and strategy were both keys to success. In the mid-1990s, I traveled to Geneva and met with my PhD thesis advisor, Hilaire, who had served as the director of the Institute of International Relations here at St. Augustine. Over dinner, Yves mentioned that he had first met Eric Williams in Geneva when Williams visited Geneva in the 1960s, and Yves was a graduate student. Yves recalled that Williams had expressed in conversation and interest in the Swiss diplomatic tradition of neutrality within the European context. Where war had defined the shifting boundaries of power and territory over the course of centuries. It was the first time I had heard of Williams's visit to Geneva, and then understood the origins of the Institute at St. Augustine. Switzerland for several centuries straddled the divisions of Europe and had succeeded in creating a successful and stable federal system, La Confédération Helvétique, that had become a cornerstone of the European order. The Swiss had managed to navigate the religious wars of Europe and the doctrinal challenges that the Protestant Reformation posed to Europe through its federal system that linked Catholic and Protestant cantons in a confederation which included Francophone, German-speaking, and Italian communities. It developed a tradition of neutrality within the heart of Europe that has prevailed over the centuries. One manifestation of that neutrality was the fact that Ulrich Zwingli, the Swiss theologian, who was a leading figure in the Protestant Reformation that challenged the Pope's authority, did not prevent the Pope and Rome from relying on the Catholic Swiss Guard to protect the papacy and its central role in the European order. They had been able to span both linguistic and religious divides to keep a confederation going for more than 4 centuries. In World War II and during the Cold War and thereafter, Switzerland as a neutral state provided the space for discussion and negotiations amongst various protagonists in major conflicts within Europe and the wider world. I would make a bold gamble and suggest that Williams, being the brilliant and sophisticated historian that he was, may have seen the Swiss example as one that could be applied to the Caribbean, as it became a major theater of Cold War conflict with the consolidation of the Cuban Revolution and the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, the year in which both Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica achieved their political independence. In effect, I would speculate that the establishment of the Institute at St. Augustine in 1966, the year that Guyana and Barbados attained their independence, was an expression of Williams's commitment to an ongoing program of Caribbean collaboration after the demise of the Federation, but in order to increase the strategic weight of the region in international affairs and as a buffer zone, nationalization of the bauxite industry in Guyana. Lloyd was a mentor, a colleague, and a friend who became a powerful influence upon my thinking about the contemporary Caribbean. It was with him that I was able to exchange perspectives and comparisons of Guyana and Trinidad, given his presence in Guyana during the critical years of the 1960s and his continuing engagement with Guyanese intellectuals. At the time, I did not fully recognize the importance of being influenced by the work of these 3 very extraordinary Trinidadian intellectuals, spanning 3 generations: C.L.R. James, Eric Williams, and Lloyd Best, notwithstanding their differences amongst each other. But that is the folly of youth. Now that I'm grayer and hopefully wiser, I can honestly say that my own intellectual trajectory was influenced by their willingness to challenge the conventional wisdom of their time and to mine the rich fields of Caribbean history in the effort to shape the future of the region. It is a challenge that faces every Caribbean intellectual, and the late Derek Walcott in his Nobel Prize lecture articulated that challenge very succinctly. He said, all of the Antilles, every island, is an effort of memory. Every mind, every racial biography culminating in amnesia and fog. Pieces of sunlight through the fog, and suddenly rainbows, arc-en-ciel. That is the effort, the labor of the Antillean imagination, rebuilding its gods from bamboo frames, phrase by phrase. I hope this lecture tonight will contribute in a small way to the labor of imagination that should continue across the generations in the Caribbean. I would also like to express a deeply held personal sentiment to my friends, colleagues, and many others whom I've met along the way. Trinidad, UB St. Augustine, and the Institute for International Relations were my portals into the wider Caribbean. It is in that spirit I'm offering a perspective on Williams that may be useful in refreshing contemporary Caribbean perspectives on the past. I will start with a very simple question. Why had Prime Minister Williams proven to be the most resilient West Indian leader in the midst of the ideological polarization that had become a factor in the region in the wake of the Cuban Revolution, the subsequent collapse of the West Indian Federation, and the turn to increasing levels of violence in the region's politics in the 1970s? The crisis of legitimacy that swept the region followed upon the so-called Rodney riots in Jamaica in 1968 and the eruption of popular protests over the politics of privilege and the perceived failures of social transformation in Trinidad in 1970. These were the two countries that had piloted the federal project, and the fact that both were shaken by unrest less than a decade after achieving independence in 1962 was an indication that the West Indian territories were entering a profound crisis of the post-colonial order. That crisis also overtook Guyana, with its turn to electoral fraud, the adoption of socialist rhetoric, and the unfortunate turn to assassination. It also moved to Jamaica, where Michael Manley's election and his subsequent advocacy of fundamental changes in the Jamaican political economy to address the historical inequities within the population triggered both increasing levels of violence and significant migration. In March 1979, the overthrow of the Cary government in a coup led by the New Jewel movement preceded the killing in June 1980 of Walter Rodney in Guyana. Later that year, the violent and bloody Jamaican election campaign illustrated the rapid descent of that country into a crisis of governance and the emergence of the culture of the Dons, where informal structures of constituency governance began to undermine and replace both local government and the state itself. Fortunately, in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, the influx of petrodollars into Trinidad and Tobago's economy helped to repair the breaches that had emerged in 1970. The oil revenues contribute to the sense of well-being in the country, but Eric Williams remained a pragmatic national and regional leader who was in many ways an enigmatic figure to both the people of Trinidad and Tobago and to the wider region. His death in 1981 ended his remarkable career as both an intellectual pioneer and a political leader in the Cold War. I would also speculate that Williams hoped that the Institute would be able to train generations of the region's diplomats to forge effective strategies and policies that could assure the security of the region and its peoples into the future. Over the course of his long career, Williams had recognized that the university was a central platform for the development of effective governance within the region, and that it could also play a role in transforming people across generations. It was one of the several reasons that he was determined to push the University of the West Indies to achieve its promise. Williams's understanding of the strategic importance of the Caribbean was evident well before his entry into the national struggle and his accession to the office of Prime Minister. In the 1942 edition of his book, The Negro in the Caribbean, Williams said, "The Caribbean is one of the most important seas, strategically speaking, in the world. It lies athwart the trade routes from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Who commands the Caribbean commands the Panama Canal." He then went on to say, "The Caribbean has become for the United States our sea, the American Mediterranean, with Puerto Rico as its Gibraltar. That fact has been brought home to the American public by press and radio. The United States government has acquired leases on bases in the British Islands. The Pan American Conference held at Havana in July 1940 was summoned to discuss the future of the European dependencies in the Caribbean should the European War result in a victory for Germany. The United States is keeping a sharp watch on Martinique with its large stock of gold, its aeroplanes, and its capital ships. And above all, its harbor, Fort de France, incomparably the best between Cuba and South America. A recent agreement with the Dutch government makes the United States partly responsible for the defense of Dutch Guiana, dangerously close to Dakar, Senegal. Williams had provided in 1942 a strategic assessment that illustrated the transformation of the Caribbean's role and status within the hemisphere within the context of World War II. It was an explicit acknowledgement that American influence and strategic thinking had become a determinant of the future of the region and the European colonies therein. However, Williams warned, there is great uneasiness among British and French West Indians that closer ties with the United States will involve the introduction of American racial attitudes. His analysis of the changed context of Caribbean life during World War II and the extension of the American strategic reach and its military presence in the region was insightful. The book also included the recognition that the economic and social consequences of the Great Depression and the structural rigidity of plantation agriculture were at the root of the fundamental problems facing the Caribbean territories of all the colonial powers, including the United States. In discussing the solutions that had to be considered for the region, Williams made the pithy observation that any solution of the internal problem would be meaningless, which continues to ignore the extension of full democratic privileges to the Negro. At present, the Caribbean lives under government of sugar, for sugar, and by sugar. It was a clear indication that Williams was already thinking about the future of the region, even as the ongoing war had yet to run its course. Alan Locke, the African-American philosopher who wrote an editorial foreword for the Negro in the Caribbean, observed that the study goes further to set the West Indies in the perspective of their historic past, as well as to present the problems of the present in a challenging and constructive interpretation looking toward their future. Locke continued, as now for several years a teacher in the United States and a citizen of the Americas in a larger sense, he is eminently fitted to link up hitherto isolated segments of the racial problems common to this hemisphere. Locke's comment was a recognition that Williams had demonstrated a breadth of perspective that was rare in the context of the USA in the 1940s, and that Williams's grasp of the transnational dimension of the African diaspora in the Americas, and especially in the Caribbean, was opening new avenues of relevance for both research and policy. Williams's own approach to that study reflected his effort to grapple with the comparative politics of race in the Caribbean and America, and to identify the variation of racial and political regimes in the Caribbean societies. What is interesting is that The Negro in the Caribbean was published 2 years before the publication of the seminal study by the Swedish social scientist Gunnar Myrdal, An American Dilemma, The Negro Problem and American Democracy. That book would revolutionize American public policy in the post-1945 era on matters of race. Myrdal collaborated closely with Ralph Bunche, the African-American political scientist who was a faculty member at Howard and a colleague of Williams. Bunche later went to work with the United Nations during the critical period after 1945, during which European and American imperial systems and ideologies were increasingly challenged. For much of the Second World War, Williams was in place to follow debates about race in the USA and the wider Americas as a faculty member at Howard University in Washington, D.C. Howard had emerged as a space for him to engage with policy debates about the trajectory of American domestic and foreign policy after the war. His affiliation with the Anglo-American Commission during the war and its later variant, the Caribbean Commission, which had been expanded to accommodate France and Holland, reflected his effort before becoming a politician to become engaged in shaping policy affecting the Caribbean. For Williams, Oxford had exposed him to elite British education and culture, and Howard University offered him an opportunity to engage with debates about the politics of liberation and social transformation in the United States and the Caribbean. This period of Williams's life should not be neglected in understanding his eventual movement from the academy into the political arena in Trinidad and Tobago. While his later break with the Caribbean Commission in 1955 has garnered considerable attention, I would suggest that Williams's sojourn in Washington was a formative period for him in developing his understanding of Anglo-American relations and the shifting terms of Anglo-American collaboration. It was also the period when he became part of wider discussions about race in both American and hemispheric contexts in Washington, and that exposure informed his later political career in the Caribbean. Williams was broadening his understanding of international relations at a time of profound crisis and war within the international system, and he was witness to the ways in which the Second World War had accelerated the crisis of the colonial order that had emerged in the 1930s. When the US State Department unsuccessfully opposed Williams's appointment as Deputy Chairman of the Caribbean Research Council, it was because he had failed to meet the expectation of careful and objective scholarship and research directed to the purposes of the organization. For me, it was a signal that Williams's publication had provoked a level of discomfiture and unease in official Washington. The American capital city was and remains a powerful microcosm of the Jim Crow regime that defined American domestic history, and just as important, its policy towards the Caribbean. Later, when Williams made his break with the Caribbean Commission, he had already begun to engage in public education activities, and the Commission's decision to decline to renew his contract suggested that the gulf between Williams and the Commission over Williams's view of his role and the institutional opposition to that role had never been bridged. His departure from the Commission was an indication that his commitment to politics in Trinidad and Tobago had become irrevocable. The years with the Commission had provided him with the opportunity to reacquaint himself with the politics in the region after his sojourn in Britain and the United States. Williams was very deliberate in his decision to use his research and scholarship to become an agent of change in the Caribbean. In the context of the mid-1950s, Williams's decision was a very logical one at the time, especially since the world had entered a period of ferment as a consequence of the increasing momentum for decolonization in Asia and the wider non-European world. In 1955, the Indonesian government hosted the Bandung Conference, which opened the path for aggressive diplomacy through the articulation of non-alignment as a platform by the Asian states that sought to escape the prison of the bipolar system that had emerged in Europe. In the Caribbean, the 1953 election campaign in British Guiana had produced a radical government that was removed from office by British troops amid the suspension of the Constitution. In 1954, the American Supreme Court had issued the Brown versus the Board of Education decision declaring segregated education a hindrance to citizenship equality. In 1956, Britain agreed to grant political independence to Ghana in 1957, and the Suez Crisis had led to the American humiliation of Britain, France, and Israel in their collaboration to preserve their roles and influence in the Middle East by bringing down the regime of Gamal Abdel Nasser. In effect, the mid-1950s marked a major shift in the direction of international politics, and the West Indian colonies were not immune to those events. Williams's decision to enter the political arena was undoubtedly influenced by the recognition that he had developed both the expertise and the reputation through his public engagement in Trinidad and the wider Caribbean to launch a viable political career. When Williams was forced to leave the Caribbean Commission in 1955, the timing was impeccable in terms of positioning himself to play an important political role in the future of Trinidad and Tobago and the debates over the embryonic West Indian Federation. I am left to wonder if factions in the British, American, and other West Indian governments were quietly supportive of Williams, because he might be able to offer an alternative to the radicalism that had emerged in British Guiana in 1953. The winds of change were already gaining momentum in the colonial Caribbean, and Williams's political future was promising. When the People's National Movement won the elections in 1956, it was the validation of Williams that also opened a new chapter in West Indian development. It is important to recognize that Williams represented a very interesting phenomenon in Caribbean life. He was a citizen of what has become known in the academic circles as the Atlantic world, linking Africa, the Americas, and Europe, which was shaped by the rise of the Atlantic seaborne empires, and his work published in Capitalism and Slavery provided a powerful focus upon the historical foundations of that Atlantic world. I would argue that Williams's scholarly orientation and his research influenced his political trajectory, but he was also singular in terms of the breadth of perspectives that he brought to bear into Caribbean politics. In fact, in a very strange way, Williams, like Cheddi Jagan in British Guiana and George Price in British Honduras, represented a fundamentally different sensibility within the region's politics that differed from and caused friction with many of the other leaders of the British West Indies. These leaders had spent a formative period of life in the United States, and unlike the other leaders who had been educated either in the West Indies and or Britain, that exposure fostered a political style that often provoked British policymakers' anxieties. Their penchant for confrontation and their unwillingness to be deferential to British strategy and policy during the 1950s was a source of enduring tension. This commonality became manifest in the debates over the West Indian Federation. Jagan and Price both sought to avoid any commitment to the embryonic federation, while Williams' work provoked a profound crisis over the issue of Chaguaramas, as a mistake made by the British government in the negotiations over the basis for destroyer deals in 1940. Williams's promotion of a strong federal government also created other tensions with leaders in the federal project, perhaps because he had lived in the USA and had seen the power of a strong federal government mobilizing a society for war over the period 1939 to 1945. Ultimately, Williams proved himself to be much more adept in the negotiations with both the British and American governments, even as his colleagues from the other territories found him problematic, as Manley's comment I cited earlier suggests. I would also suggest that the years spent as a researcher and analyst with the Caribbean Commission, the travel he undertook across the region, his discussions with his faculty colleagues at Howard University, and the breadth of general knowledge that informed his political engagement should not be underestimated in the shaping of his career and his own decision-making processes. It seems that Williams's approach to governance and the longevity of his tenure as leader of Trinidad and Tobago were all rooted in his profound respect for knowledge in both historical and contemporary contexts, in the capacity to think beyond convenient ideological categories, and his own awareness that strategic thinking was key to a successful career in politics. Williams embodied an approach that my very wise grandmother, who navigated the political chaos of the 1960s with considerable aplomb and patience, often advocated. Time is always longer than twine, a reference to the importance of patience. Williams, over the course of his career, understood the importance of patience as a fundamental ingredient in politics and diplomacy. One of the questions that has intrigued me for years is whether during his research that led to the publication of The Negro in the Caribbean, whether Williams developed an appreciation of the challenges of political independence for Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Cuba, which would inform his thinking about the West Indian Federation. These three countries had all been occupied by the United States in the early 20th century, and American policy towards these countries had all provoked serious political and economic dislocation in these societies. As mentioned earlier, he was cognizant of the unease that had been generated in the French and English colonies when US military forces were sent to these territories during the Second World War. The U.S. military has always recruited actively in the southern states of the United States, and it remained a deeply segregated institution well into the 20th century. Its record in the occupation of these three Caribbean societies, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Haiti, were not a product of enlightenment policy, and Williams was aware of that record. Williams' willingness to question the terms under which the Chaguaramas base had been acquired, once he had seen the classified records of those discussions, and his imputation of reckless disregard for Trinidadian sentiment displayed by the U.S. military during the negotiations over the Chaguaramas base, perhaps reflected his unease with the American military presence in Trinidad. Williams recognized that the British governor in 1940 had made a more forceful argument than the imperial government for limiting the demands that the Americans sought to impose on Trinidad at a point of profound weakness. Williams was clear about the need to avoid a repetition of the mistakes made in 1940, and that the American government should, as a matter of principle, accept that the world had changed. Despite the duplicity that informed the American negotiating strategy during the negotiations, Williams held firm, just as he did on the issue of the tone of his publications during his stint with the Caribbean Commission. His patience and persistence were both instructive and successful in forcing the American authorities to reconsider their position and their negotiating strategy in discussing the strategic significance of Chaguaramas in an era where intercontinental ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons had begun to redefine the notions of American security. I have often wondered whether Williams's research of the book informed his questioning of the 1940 Chaguaramas Agreement. Was he concerned that the maintenance of the 99-year lease would create a context in which subsequent American administrations would expand the uses of the base to encompass activities not envisaged in 1940? Did the Prime Minister recognize the needs to forge a strategy to minimize the risk of military intervention in the West Indian territories? The American covert intervention in British Guiana, starting in 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, and the subsequent intervention by the Johnson administration in the Dominican Republic in 1965 demonstrated the wisdom of Williams's search for a diplomatic strategy to limit the vulnerability of the region to military intervention and confrontation. This level of strategic thinking is one of the attributes that Williams displayed over the course of his political career. And I would argue it is an important component of the legacy that Williams bequeathed to the region. As some of the older heads here tonight may recall, in the 1970s, both Guyana under Forbes Burnham and Michael Manley in Jamaica in the 1970s had actively engaged with the non-aligned movement in an effort to heighten the international profile of the English-speaking Caribbean and to pursue strategies of radical populism in domestic politics. As a consequence, both Guyana and Jamaica became targets of American displeasure for their rhetorical radicalism during this period, especially in the wake of the American defeat in Vietnam, on the unprecedented display of Soviet military force protection in collaboration with Cuban military units in southern Africa. South African efforts to preserve a buffer zone around its apartheid regime were seriously compromised by the rise of Soviet and Cuban-backed radical independent governments in Angola and Mozambique. Further, the overthrow of the Somoza dictatorship in Nicaragua and the seizure of power by the Sandinista movement created even greater uncertainty for the U.S. in its proverbial backyard. I would suggest that Williams's option in the 1970s for studied neutrality as a foreign policy strategy, as opposed to the pursuit of non-alignment, was a major factor in the difference in the terms of Trinidad and Tobago's engagement with the USA in the 1970s, especially when compared with the American response to both Burnham's Guyana and Manley's Jamaica in their pursuit of higher profiles within the non-aligned movement. Earlier, Williams had joined the effort with Barbados, Jamaica, and Guyana to establish diplomatic relations with Castro's Cuba in 1972. and the coordinated approach by the four countries had provided a measure of insulation for the group's effort to break the American-led strategy of diplomatic isolation of Cuba within the hemisphere. It was an instructive lesson in the coordination of West Indian diplomacy in dealing with the Cold War tensions in the Caribbean. But unfortunately, it did not lay the foundation for the long-term strategic collaboration that was required to manage intra-hemispheric relations over the longer term. As Jamaica and Guyana moved towards more active engagement with the non-aligned movement, the politics of regional fragmentation again reared its head, to the detriment of the region's diplomatic effectiveness at both hemispheric and global levels. In offering this analysis of Eric Williams's diplomatic legacy, I would suggest that in an era where the United States has embarked upon a redefinition of its security and foreign policy strategy, the independent Caribbean countries will need to rethink the terms of engagement with the United States. As Williams recognized in 1942, World War II changed the context of Caribbean existence. I would suggest that in the contemporary context defined by the increasing assertiveness of China as a major power and the emergence of the Asia-Pacific region as the central axis of the international system, the Caribbean countries will need to reposition themselves to address this new configuration of global power and influence. Eric Williams's diplomatic legacy as a political leader and strategic thinker offers the region both a precedent and a model for thinking about the future of the region, and the need to devise an effective regional strategy for addressing the future of these societies. Given what has happened with the hurricanes this season, there's a certain urgency that has emerged. I would like to thank, again, the governor and his colleagues at the Central Bank for this opportunity to address these issues. I would also like to thank Senator Mirage for her engagement with me or encouragement of me to stay engaged with the Caribbean after the passing of Lloyd Best. And two very special friends, Anna Romero and Michael Lashley, with whom I've enjoyed close ties over the past 40 years, due to the fact that we have spent time together in the Caribbean, Europe, and North America, as the endurance race of our professional lives evolved. To many of the friendships I have made, and to many of the other friends I have made in Trinidad and among Trinidadians, and I can only say thanks for the time shared, however briefly, and for the generosity of spirit that I received. I hope this helps.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fraser. Can you just give him another round of applause? So what I said to him in the corner was that I needed him to stay there because I was going to invite the governor to make a presentation to him as a token of appreciation from the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you, Governor. Thank you, Dr. Fraser. At this time, we would also like to make a few special presentations because we always recognize people who take time to spend with us, notwithstanding their very busy schedules. So, Governor, I always have extra work for you. So as you hand over there, if you can join us right there. And I'd just like you to present to Dr. the Honorable Keith Rowley, Prime Minister of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you so much for being here this evening. Thank you. And Governor, stay put, because I'd like you to present to Mrs. Rowley, a token to Mrs. Rowley. So no, yes, right, good. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Governor. Thank you. Dr. Sukram, Deputy Governor, if you can just join us. I'd like you to make a presentation to Chief Justice, the Honorable Justice Iva Archie. Thank you very much, and to Mrs. Denise Rodriguez Archie, thank you for taking the time. If I can just call, I'm actually going to call somebody else to do some work for me. Patrick Solomon, can you come forward for me, please? I'd like you to make a presentation to the Honorable Mrs. Bridget Anissa George. Can you come forward, please? Thank you for coming. You have to turn to the right. And to Mr. Newman George, thank you for coming. Sue. Patrick, Patrick. Thank you very much. Thank you. Amrita, if you can come forward to make these other presentations. To Mrs. Pearl Fraser, thank you so much for coming and joining your husband and for gracing us with your presence. Thank you. And finally, Amrita, if you'd stay, I'd like you to make a presentation to Mrs. Hilaire. You see, we take so much of Governor's time, and we appreciate the sacrifice you make, and we just like to thank you for that and for being here. Thank you, Amrita. Thank you, Mrs. Hilaire. It's now my privilege to invite my colleague, Mrs. Michelle Chongtabel, Inspector of Financial Institutions, to bring a vote of thanks on behalf of the bank. Michelle, thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to give appreciation to everyone who's made this evening's event a success. Firstly, we especially thank the Prime Minister, Dr. the Honorable Keith Rowley and Mrs. Sharon Rowley for joining us here tonight. We would also like to thank the Honorable Chief Justice, Mr. Justice Iva Archie, Mrs. Denise Rodriguez Archie, and the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Mrs. Bridget Anissa George, for spending the time with us. To Governor Alvin Hilaire and Mrs. Sheila Hilaire, thank you for hosting this very enlightening lecture in honor of Dr. Eric Williams. This event has come at the end of a somewhat unprecedented week in my living memory. We started off wonderful for our friends in beautiful Dominica. I certainly felt helpless just imagining what it must feel like to be sitting in my home waiting for Maria to come, not to mention the folks in Barbuda, Tortola, Guadeloupe, and St. Martin. Unimaginable to me their despair after Irma, and to find out that Maria was on a direct path in their direction. Then as the week went on, we heard about earthquakes in Mexico and Japan, and we read about speeches and the reactions at the UN General Assembly. On the surface, it's been the usual hectic, busy, frenetic work week. However, the events of the week have made it a week somehow compelling introspection. So when I came here earlier, I asked myself, what lessons will I be able to take away from this memorial lecture? At the bank, we've been thoughtfully and purposefully looking into the lessons we can learn from past experiences, good and bad. It's why this annual celebration of Dr. Williams's legacy is ever more important to us. So thank you, Dr. Fraser. You have been faithful to the tradition of this memorial lecture. Thank you for reminding us that the man at the forefront of our country's independence that we celebrated only a few weeks ago, an independence forged from the love of liberty, was also a man who understood the strategic importance of the Caribbean, who understood the value of combining our resources, and I dare say sharing of risk, and of course, our voice. Irma and Maria will not be the last disasters to affect the Caribbean. We've been reminded this week of how vulnerable we all are to events totally outside of our control: earthquakes, hurricanes, oil price shocks. As we contemplate how to survive, prosper, and build resilience in the new normal, we are grateful for historians like you, Dr. Fraser, who can help us to understand the lessons of the past, to inspire us and bring the events to life as you so ably did for us today. Dr. Fraser, you said that you're seeing parallels between then and now, and that the region needs to learn from Dr. Williams' diplomatic legacy to rethink the modus operandi. Well, it's been reported that the Prime Minister of Dominica, the Honorable Roosevelt Scarrett, expressed the sentiment that he was comforted that the common experience of past weeks had ignited a greater sense of unity of purpose in the Caribbean. So maybe we're at the cusp of a tipping point towards that Caribbean identity, or maybe it's just my wishful thinking in my mood of introspection, so we'll see. We'd also like to offer a very special thank you to the family of Dr. Eric Williams for their continued support. I'd also like to add my thanks to that of the Governor and Dr. Fraser to recognize the work of the Lloyd Best Institute and Ms. Suniti Maraj for their contribution to the opening of this evening's event. We want to recognize those who executed the set for bringing Shagaramas and Woodford Square to the auditorium, and thanks to all of the teams and staff at the bank and those who participated in the organization of this event under the able leadership of Mrs. NICOLE CROOKS, Senior Manager, Human Resources, Industrial and External Relations. And last but not least, thank you to all our guests for your overwhelming response and interest. To the schools in particular, thank you for encouraging your students to participate in our lecture series and fostering their interest in the history of our country and the discourse. August 31st marked the 55th anniversary of our independence, and on Sunday we commemorate the 41st anniversary of the coming into effect of Trinidad and Tobago's Constitution, Republic Day. On behalf of Governor Hilaire, the Board of Directors, management and staff of the bank, I extend warm greetings to you and your families as we celebrate these important milestones in our nation's history. We've come to the end of the official part of this evening. I now invite you to the reception. Please remain seated as we allow the persons in the first two rows, stage center, to exit the auditorium. Our ushers will then guide you to the main concourse for the reception. Thanks again, everyone.
Still in my memory, yeah. 1960, still in my memory, it was right here in Trinidad. Things happen both good and bad. One thing would always stay with me till eternity. Was a day of all days to remember.